Welcome, everybody, to another OAGI webinar. My name is Jim Wilson, and I am the President and CEO of the Open Applications Group. Today's topic is context. We're going to go into a little deeper dive. A couple of weeks ago, my colleague, Michael Figura, delivered a related webinar, and the video is posted to the OAGI website. So you can go to oagi.org and just go down under resources, and you'll see the link to videos. And there's a video there, Score-Context is King. It could be by the time you get there, this will be reordered with new videos added, but you should be able to hunt it down. These two videos should go together. So Michael shared with you how OAGI supports context in the tool that we have developed jointly with the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. And he used a few scenarios to sort of illustrate the points about how SCORE is implemented, has implemented context, and then how we use it to drive our message profiles development. Okay, so context. I like to think of it as inescapable and sometimes tragically ignored. Well, what do we mean by context? Well, when you think about the work you do in an enterprise to integrate your systems with each other within the enterprise and integrate your systems with systems in other enterprise, in other words, B2B scenarios, your company integrating with other companies, and then A2A scenarios, systems within your own company integrating with each other. All of these integrations are done in some sort of context. Whether you think of it in those terms or not, it's true. So even the whole categories around A2A versus B2B, those categories are context, and they influence the ways in which you specify what information is exchanged. In an A2A scenario, if you're able to overcome internal politics, you should be able to arrive at an agreeable approach throughout the enterprise to how you move data around. In B2B scenarios, perhaps you go to an industry consortia to develop message specs, or perhaps it's a trading partner by trading partner basis, but that's a little different. So context is the set of sort of what we think of as context categories and their values that apply to a particular integration. And it always matters, as I just said. Now, sometimes it is often intuitive, obvious, and consequently not worth explicitly identifying, but I would argue that when in doubt, call it out. In other words, I have never found it to be overkill to explicitly state this is the scope, or this is my context, which in turn has a relationship to scope. Okay, so you're probably thinking, oh, okay, what does defining scope look like? And we will get into that here in a few minutes. All right, but first, why does it matter? Well, consider the following. This is an OAGIS process purchase order schema. Now, no one ever said that the line count is a measure of a schema's size, but I think you can agree that 18,000 lines is a very big schema, according to any measure. All right. And what happens is you get developers and they're just, it blows their mind. They're like, holy smoke, you expect me to implement that? You want me to tie two systems together with that? You want me to talk to our suppliers or our customers about integrating that? And kind of the upside here is that, well, something that big, surely it will meet all our needs on one hand. On the other hand, something that big is just so big, like where do you start? How do you, you don't need all of it, so where do you go? And again, I want to refer you back to Michael Figuera's first video on score and context and how that tool allows us to pick and choose the parts of a message that you need and sort of pare it down. All right, so you have this giant message. The developer's like, oh man, I don't know where to start. So if you use SCORE, if you define a context, a business context, you define a business context, and then you take a big message and you go through a process we call profiling to pick the parts of the message relevant to the context, maybe you can trim it down to something that's much more manageable. Maybe it's 193 lines. Maybe it's 800 lines. But in any event, it's better than 14,000 lines of content. And of course, with schemas like this, you're going to be using tools like SCORE, XML Spy, Oxygen XML, maybe some other modeling tools built into, Visual Studio or Eclipse or something like that. All right, and then that leads to happy developers. And I joke a little bit here. Let's face it, no developer's terribly thrilled about, mapping to standard specs, but I think you would agree that that is more likely than that, given the transition. Okay, so that is the purpose of defining a context, a business context, and then applying it to a standard through a process we call profiling to choose the parts you want and then produce resources that a developer can put their headphones on, grab a Red Bull, get to work, and produce the integration resources, the transformations, the mapping in some load process, whatever, to make your systems more interoperable. All right, so what are the foundations for context? Again, Michael ran you through the practical implementation using SCORE, but its foundations lie in an ISO spec, and this spec's called ISO 15000, Part 5, Electronic Business Extensible Markup Language, or EBXML, Part 5, Core Component Specification. And this is part of the suite of specs that came out of the effort that started in the early 2000s. There were, I think, 6 parts, and this is Part 5. UNCFACT, United Nations Center for Trade Facilitation and Electronic Business, initially did this work, and then once it was completed, handed it off to ISO. And I led the working group that produced Core Component Technical Spec version 3 from UNCFACT that was handed to ISO for standardization here. So this specification has a part that addresses context, and I'll show you where that is here in just a moment. But from a bigger picture perspective, it shows how to, or provides a specification for developing an information model that is not tied to any particular syntax. And OAG has embraced this for our OAGIS standard. We have implemented it, all of OAGIS, our standard, the Open Applications Group Integration Specification. All of OAGIS is expressed in a core component compliant way in a database. And then from it, we produce developer resources such as XML schema, JSON schema, API specs, things like that. So in this spec, there's a section on context. It is section 5 here, and it has 3 parts to it. This spec is, like many ISO specifications, a for-fee resource. The fee is not much. I mean, hey, if you do this in your organization for a living, which, I mean, why else would you look at this stuff, frankly? it's not much. Just have somebody cough up a few bucks, a few Swiss francs, and buy the spec. So anyway, part 5, context. And a key element of it are the ISO 15000 context categories. And, fingers crossed that this is fair use. My duplication of it here. Again, go by the spec. So what we have here is we have a set of context categories. And the way you can think of defining context is you specify a context category and then values associated for it. So your business context is the set of context categories and their values. And we'll look next at a SCORE implementation of this, which breaks it down a little further. But the context categories include business process, and that's just what it sounds like. That includes things like order to cash, procure to pay, build to order, build to spec, whatever it is you think of as a business process. Some people like to look to APQC, I think, for some context categories. Other people just define them internally. Other people look to industry consortia for their business process context. But in any event, that is one major context category. Another one is product classification. Frankly, I've never seen this used. I'm sure it has been. Another one is industry classification. I see this used all the time, and of course that includes industries such as aerospace and defense, agriculture, chemical, finance, human resources, you name it. There's depending on which context scheme you're using, there could be hundreds of or maybe even thousands of industry classifications. Another context category is geopolitical. And it's a combination of political and geographic factors influencing or delineating a country or region. And that could be, of course, state-based, as in country-based. So, France, Thailand, the United States, Brazil, and so on. Also, it can be kind of a political union like the European Union. What used to be the North American Free Trade Agreement. That's changed to something else now. But anyway, that includes United States, Canada, Mexico. It can also include regions that are not specifically defined, in terms of being a legal jurisdiction. So things like West Bank. So there could be, in various scenarios, certain qualifications to information that is sent based on, let's say, shipments of grain into those regions. That's one real life example that comes to mind. And then there's official constraints. I've not seen that used. Business process role. That makes sense, but that tends to be so detailed that I don't see that used, in the sense that it's usually two roles that are exchanging information, and therefore, a business role by itself, in my experience, doesn't make much sense. Maybe a pair makes sense, but usually the business roles are defined in the business process, and I just don't see business process roles used. The same thing with supporting roles. I don't see that applied. System capabilities, that does come up from time to time, and it's usually, it comes up in situations where there are limitations in a system. So in my experience, kind of big picture, and let me be clear, my experience spans both B2B and A to A, and context, as I'll show you in a later slide, is pretty clearly defined in B2B scenarios. A to A, it seems to be the best practices about the defining business processes and using them is not has not emerged, at least publicly. Maybe within companies they feel like they have a pretty good handle on it. But certainly in B2B, business process, industry classification, and geopolitical are used a lot. These are the big three. And then again, sometimes system capability will pop up, definitely in A-to-A scenarios, but even in B2B where somebody says, well, I have such and such legacy system and my system is just incapable of accepting identifiers that are longer than, 12 characters in length. Okay, well, that's just a real world situation that you got to deal with. And business context allows you a way to define those sorts of things. So I gave you examples of business process, industry, and geopolitical. When we talk about business context itself, well, let's just go to the next slide. This is what I call a quick and dirty diagram. It's a quick and dirty UML class diagram. And I've got a brief detour on this point here in a minute about how I produced this. But this shows the relationship as we have implemented it in SCORE. Again, SCORE is a tool jointly developed by OAGI and NIST to promote integration, to help companies integrate their systems. And the way we've implemented it in SCORE is we have context categories, and those are, we certainly include some of those categories that I mentioned on the previous slide. And then we have context schemes. So again, context categories would be things like business process, industry, geopolitical, system constraints. A context scheme would be an instance of a category. So you could have for example, for business process, maybe you're using APQC. Again, I think that's the acronym. For geopolitical, maybe you're using the ISO code list for countries. For industry, maybe you're using, some, UN defined industry list. Okay, so. And sometimes you're going to have, one for each context category, you're going to have one context scheme, and then you have the set of values. So let's say you have context categories, geopolitical, context scheme is whatever the ISO code list is for, for country codes. And then you have this context scheme values, which would be the country codes in that list. Okay. And again, you can have multiple context schemes per context category. You can have multiple context scheme values per context scheme, of course. And then you can relate, there's a relationships of many to many between context scheme values and business context. So again, business context would be something like, and these are real world examples. I've used them in the last couple of years. You could have things like industry equals agriculture, or maybe even more specifically seed. So industry equals seed, business process equals order to cash, and geography equals Canada. Okay, or maybe you could have a context of industry equals aerospace and defense. Business process is build the spec, and geopolitical is global. All right. So once you have defined the business context, then the next thing is that you can use that business context, again, in SCORE, as we've implemented in SCORE, to develop BIEs. Now, what are BIEs? Well, again, Michael went over it in his video. I'd refer you to that, but very quickly, a BIE is a message that has been profiled. It's a message where you have said, okay, in this business context, this big message, we're just picking certain parts of it, and that's my business information entity. That's my smaller profiled message that is applicable in the defined context or contexts that I've associated with it. Okay, hopefully that's clear enough. Again, this is the first time delivering this presentation, so I really, really encourage you to send any questions or comments to member.services@oagi.org. All right, moving on. I mentioned a brief detour on modeling. The model on the previous slide was quick and dirty. Microsoft's Visual Studio Code is a free and really useful text editor, and there's a plugin called PlantUML, and it's free. And so PlantUML is free. There is a Visual Studio Code plugin for it, and it is great for quick and dirty diagrams. I find it especially useful for UML sequence diagrams, although on the previous slide that was a UML class diagram. Let me be very clear though. I recommend you check out that combination, the combination being Visual Studio Code and the PlantUML plugin. However, it is not suitable for serious modeling, for which you'll need something like Trisatex Digital Enterprise Suite, Spark Systems Enterprise Architect, or one of Nomagic's various modeling tools. But continuing on this detour for one more slide, this is what it looks like in PlantUML, and really it's not even that complicated. So this is the part we care about. It's just those 4 lines, and then there's 4 lines of style stuff, which frankly you don't even need that. And that's it. And that lets you produce a simple diagram. Again, not suitable for serious modeling. This is the purpose of this is create a quick and dirty pretty picture and throw it in a slide sort of thing. So we're kind of getting near the end here. I just want to touch on a note of A2A versus B2B. Again, A2A is application to application that is integrating systems within the enterprise, integrating one ERP system with another, integrating a manufacturing execution system with an ERP system, integrating a warehouse management system with an ERP system, things like that, versus B2B, where your typical example of B2B is sending purchase orders, order create, order response, process invoice, notify shipment, those sorts of messages. And for B2B, using context has been fairly clear. That's not to say that we can't get more sophisticated with it, but as I mentioned earlier, process, industry, and geopolitical seem to be well accepted context categories. So you say those context categories, you say what the values are. Again, example being, just to change things up a little bit, crop nutrition or fertilizer, Mexico, and order to cash for the process, or maybe field operations, for example. A2A is still a little messy in the sense that people, in our experience, companies implementing context within their 4 walls either don't use it consistently, or maybe they do, and I just the best practices about their implementation hasn't emerged in a more public setting. And certainly in OAGI, our members share experiences in using SCORE, doing integrations, things like that. And so we're eager to take what appears to be messy and maybe develop some best practices about specifying business context in 8A scenarios and then using it in message profiling. So again, it is a little messy, business unit. So let's take a big aerospace and defense organization. Maybe they have context categories a context category called business unit, and they have values for defense or military, commercial, space systems, and repairable maintenance business units or something like that. Another one is geopolitical. And so for these companies, there's some sense that, well, what I'm doing, this message I'm profiling, it definitely works for North America or the United States. So let me specify that context. But then, they finish profiling that message, and the question may come up like, okay, well, does this apply to United Arab Emirates also? And so then what do? Do you say, okay, it's the U.S. plus United Arab Emirates, or do I just go ahead and say it's global? Like, do I start off global, and then if I find out that it doesn't work for South Africa, then I, say everything but South Africa? So it's unclear. And by the way, some of these things could apply in B2B too. It's usually, though, that B2B it's a little more clear cut. So anyway, A to A can be a little messier. And I will stress that the way in which a company implements context should be addressed in its governance model. Okay, and the governance model should address the way in which a company profiles messages, the way in which it produces developer resources, the way it versions developer resources, the way in which it drives consistency across the enterprise. So there's all sorts of things that go into addressing a governance model for effective new integrations and effective maintenance of integrations over time. And again, the OAGI members spend a fair amount of time discussing these sorts of things, and we are beginning to build up a little library of kind of practices. I don't know that we call them best practices just yet, but some resources that we need to spend a little time organizing and shaping into what we're comfortable calling best practices and publishing. And of course, you're welcome to, if your company is not an OAGI member, we welcome your membership and welcome your contribution to all of this. Again, context, it's inescapable and it's sometimes tragically ignored. And with that completes my presentation. So thanks you all for joining. Again, comments are welcome at member.services@oagi.org. Thanks again and have a great day. We look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Bye-bye.